Hand them over, or I will. Now, Boris Johnson lays down the gauntlet to the Cabinet Office, asking why it is refusing to hand over his WhatsApp messages. All of which does beg the question, why are they refusing to hand them over, and who exactly is responsible for what looks increasingly like a rather peculiar decision? Also on News at 10. ITV calls in an outside lawyer to review its actions in the Philip Schofield affair. It's a declaration of war. Kremlin insiders appear to threaten British military leaders with assassination. The beautiful River Wye has its cleanliness rating downgraded again. And the 80-year-old with a new pacemaker, proving you are never too old to try something new.
And my daughter and granddaughter, but they did say to me on Saturday, well, what's going to come up for your 90th, Nancy? And I said, well, I've got 9 years to think about that.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Not for the first time in his colourful political career, Boris Johnson has set a metaphorical cat amongst the pigeons. He has put the government of his successor, Rishi Sunak, in a mighty awkward spot by handing all the unedited WhatsApp messages and notebooks requested by the COVID inquiry to the Cabinet Office. What's more, Mr Johnson wants them to be passed on to the inquiry urgently. Now, followers of this increasingly peculiar saga will know that the Cabinet Office started out by saying it wasn't going to hand over a lot of the messages because they were not relevant. When the chair of the inquiry said relevance was for her to determine, they then claimed they didn't have the notes and messages after all. Now, we know they definitely do have them. In fact, Mr Johnson's spokesman says the material has been available for months. So what you might ask is the hold-up. Is it Mr Sunak who is worried about what they may reveal, or someone else at the top of government? And if so, why?
His daily addresses to the nation affected every single one of our lives. Now, Boris Johnson says he's handed over the material he used to inform his decisions during the pandemic.
We're at a pivotal point now in the early 21st century, right?
Today, the former Prime Minister was speaking about the war in Ukraine, but his actions off camera have piled pressure on the current government. Boris Johnson's material includes 24 notebooks, his diaries and WhatsApp messages with cabinet ministers, advisers and senior civil servants. Johnson's team said the Cabinet Office has had access to that for several months and received more material today. But the Cabinet Office is refusing to give the COVID inquiry material it does not consider relevant.
Can the inquiry do its job properly if it doesn't have complete access to all this information that the Cabinet Office has got?
No, and the reason for that very simply is the inquiry has to have confidence. It only has confidence if it's seen as independent of government, and it only has confidence as a result if it's seen to get the material it thinks it needs.
The Cabinet Office's own lawyers are assessing what material should be handed over. The independent chair of the COVID inquiry says that should be for her to decide. One cabinet minister during the pandemic just wants the inquiry to begin.
Why then is the Cabinet Office being less transparent than the former Prime Minister?
The Cabinet Office has a responsibility to good government and to say, look, this is just silly. And this inquiry that's already cost apparently £100 million of taxpayers' money will go on forever. That we won't have died of COVID, we'll have died of old age before this inquiry is finished if it carries on at this rate.
The inquiry has given the government a deadline of 4 o'clock tomorrow to change its mind. This morning, ministers were hoping for a quick resolution.
Well, we provided, as I say, 55,000 documents, all these witness statements, corporate witness statements and so on. There are these WhatsApps which are being looked into by the Cabinet Office at the moment. There is this deadline tomorrow, and it may well be that everything is resolved by then.
Boris Johnson's move today has set a new precedent for the COVID inquiry and piled pressure on his successor to follow his course.
And Harry is here to shed some light on all this. Look, this is rather a peculiar saga, isn't it? I mean, Boris Johnson probably rather enjoying putting his successor in an awkward spot, But what's going on here? Who doesn't want to hand these over and why not?
Well, the government says that ministers aren't involved in any of the decisions about what is handed over to the inquiry and what isn't. They say independent lawyers are in charge of that. A KC, in fact, is making that assessment over what to give the inquiry. They say this is the usual way of doing things, and ministers say there's absolutely nothing to hide here. Ultimately, though, of course, the Prime Minister is in charge of the government. If he wanted to, he could order the Cabinet Office to hand over all this information, and you would assume the Cabinet Office would have to follow his instructions. Now, we did get a bit of a flavour of what government decision-making was like when those messages from Matt Hancock were leaked to the Daily Telegraph and published there. And I think it's fair to say that that flavour we got didn't shed that decision-making by ministers during the pandemic in the best light. So you can understand why there may be some reluctance to hand over all of this information completely unredacted. Now, tomorrow there's this deadline of 4 p.m. set by Baroness Hallett, the chair of the inquiry. If there's no resolution, she says she will go to the courts, and it will be the courts that decide whether the Cabinet Office or she prevails. I think the bigger picture here is, look, this COVID inquiry hasn't even started yet. The first televised hearing is not due to begin for another 2 weeks, and already this row with government has sort of exploded over what information the inquiry has got access to. This inquiry is expected to go on for years and years, and I think it's already clear it's not just going to have an impact on this government, it's going to have an impact on previous governments and future governments as well.
Harry, that was very clear. Thank you very much indeed. Now, ITV acted today to try to put an end to the speculation and damaging infighting that has been going on over its daytime programme. This morning, it has called in a barrister to examine the facts. ITV also revealed it had questioned both presenter Philip Schofield and the young man he was having an affair with as recently as this month.
And I was getting to the point where I knew I wasn't honest with myself.
ITV says it feels badly let down by Philip Schofield, and it is the extent of his deception that has made an external examination of events preceding his departure from ITV necessary. In a letter to the government and to MPs, ITV Chief Executive Carolyn McCall sets out, as she puts it, some facts about the network's investigation of reports of Schofield's affair with a younger member of staff. Given the ongoing rumours, she says, we continue to ask questions of both parties who both continue to deny the rumours, including as recently as this month. The letter confirms that the ITV employee involved in the affair was aged 19 when he first did work experience at This Morning in 2015 and 20 years old when he applied and succeeded in securing a job as a runner on the show. He left ITV in 2021, says Dame Carolyn. We have offered our support, she says, throughout this period and indeed are still doing so. The review will be led by a KC, Jane Mulcahy. She is to look at ITV's records and talk to the people involved. Her work will also consider whether ITV needs to change or strengthen any relevant processes or policies.
I think it's very important for ITV to have this investigation to lay to rest the rumor mill. There have been many allegations of, quote unquote, a cover-up by the CEO, Carolyn McCall. And those are no doubt very unfounded because Carolyn McCall runs a very large company with many things to do, many more things than inquire herself into, ferreting out rumors on what is one show this morning among many others.
See you on Monday. Bye.
Bye.
The resignation of one of ITV's biggest stars has put the show he fronted under scrutiny as never before, and serious questions are being asked about how he was managed. This is his former employer's attempt to answer them.
And Geraint joins me now. This rumbles on, rather, doesn't it? Why have ITV launched this inquiry?
Well, as well as addressing the Schofield issue, I think it's also a response to some of the wider claims that have been made about bad management at This Morning over the last 10 days or so, notably by Dr. Ranj Singh, was one of the show's main contributors, says he was managed out of the programme after he complained about its toxic culture, in his words. Dame Carolyn addresses that directly in the letter. She says his complaint was investigated by an external advisor. No evidence of bullying or discrimination was found. But it's also, Tom, this letter, as well as being addressed to the Culture Secretary, it was also addressed to the head of Ofcom, the media regulator. And that's because safeguarding making sure that people who work on or who appear on television programmes are properly looked after is an extremely serious issue in television right now. And ITV wants to reassure the regulator that it takes that issue seriously, and it wants to do that before at least one of its senior executives has to go before the Culture Select Committee of MPs to answer questions about the Schofield affair and how it was handled next week.
Right, also very clear. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Britain's backing for Ukraine has long rankled Russia. Today came barely disguised threats towards the UK from senior Russian politicians. From President Putin's trusted Foreign Secretary, Sergei Lavrov, the accusation that London was directly inciting what he called Ukrainian terrorists. From President Putin's predecessor, Dmitry Medvedev, even stronger words. The UK's support for Ukraine amounted to a declaration of war, he said, and made British politicians and commanders legitimate military targets.
The war is coming to Russia. Day after day, ordinary Russians are waking up to news of attacks within their borders. Nothing to what they're inflicting on Ukrainians, but drone attacks like this on an oil refinery in Krasnodar are not what the Kremlin thought they were getting into a year ago. This is the aftermath of shelling in the Russian border city of Belgorod, where the danger is now such that they're ordering the evacuation of children to safer areas. The culprits, they say, not so much the Ukrainians as the British. Former President Dmitry Medvedev today tweeting that Britain, our eternal enemy, is leading an undeclared war against Russia. That being the case, any of its public officials can be considered as legitimate military targets. Yesterday's speech by Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, insisting that Ukraine has the right to strike targets inside Russia, has particularly upset them. State television today making this threat against him personally.
Мол, обезвредить Россию вполне законно. В свою очередь, мы считаем, что для того, чтобы обезвредить Клеверли, надо сделать так, чтобы, например, знаменитый солсберецкий шпиль взял и упал главе Foreign Office прямо на голову.
While we've heard similar threats from both Medvedev and Russian TV in recent months, the words of their foreign minister Sergei Lavrov touring southern Africa can be taken much more seriously. You know that London is one of the main string pullers, he said, of those who are inciting the whole West to support Ukraine more and more openly. This is a direct incitement to what the terrorists in Kiev have been doing. The reality, of course, is that NATO countries whose foreign ministers are meeting in Oslo tonight have been holding Ukraine back, privately, sometimes even publicly urging restraint. And all have forbidden Kiev from using the weapons they've supplied against targets inside Russia's internationally recognized borders. But Putin's anger, the anger of a bully whose victim dares to fight back, may need an outlet. If so, the UK may need to take the threat seriously. James Mates, News at 10.
The man who was Donald Trump's vice president, Mike Pence, will launch his attempt to get the top job a week today. Mr. Pence will be among those taking on his old boss for the Republican Party's nomination for the presidency. He's expected to make the announcement on a visit to Iowa, which votes early in the caucus season, and where he's expected to campaign for the state's conservative, evangelical Christian voters. Regular train users will need no reminder at the start of another run of rail strikes. It is coming up for a year since they started. Well, today it was the turn of drivers from the ASLEF union to shut down more than half of services operated by 15 companies on Walkout Wednesday. They'll strike again on Saturday, FA Cup final and Epsom Derby day. Meanwhile, pay talks, like the trains, have been going nowhere, and commuters who can work from home did so once again.
Another day, another deserted train station. This is the 30th rail strike, and while picket lines have become pretty normal, they're still catching people out.
There's only transport running to Wales today for every hour. Booked an hotel, we've booked everything. We've gutted really because of the kids.
We thought there was a train going to London, but there's nothing, so cancelled our holiday for children.
I've had to rebook another set of tickets to come from a different station to come to here because we're coming to see Coldplay.
Unions say the government has deliberately offered them a deal which was destined to fail and have rejected a pay rise of 4% for this year and next, depending on changes to working conditions.
We don't want to be here. This is a Westminster problem. We don't have problems in Scotland or Wales or in freight or open access or in TfL or elsewhere. We have a problem with Westminster.
But the government insists its pay offer is fair and reasonable.
They've been offered 4% and another 4% in the next year. The average train driver is earning about £60,000 a year. 20% of train drivers earn over £70,000. It's important that we have pay settlements that are realistic.
Normally 30 trains an hour leave Manchester Piccadilly, but today there are only 3 trains an hour. And with 15 train operating companies taking part in today's strike action, commuters have pretty much given up hope of getting from A to B on time. Today's strike by the drivers' union ASLEF is the first of 3 walkouts this week and has affected an estimated 60% of rail services. On Friday, members of the RMT union will walk out, affecting around half of services. Another ASLEF strike will take place on Saturday, affecting the Epsom Derby, the England versus Ireland Test match at Lord's, as well as several concerts by stars including Elton John and Beyoncé, and the all-Manchester FA Cup final at Wembley. And whether you're a red or a blue, the travel frustrations are the same.
It could be really disappointing because there's going to be so many people who would really want to go to what could well be a once-in-a-lifetime game, you know, given that over 100 years of history of both clubs never played them in a cup final, and that's really sad to see.
Unions insist they are not deliberately targeting major events, but with 300,000 people expected at concerts in Manchester over the next 3 days, for members of the public, the misery continues. Amy Welch, News at 10.
More and cheaper childcare for those struggling to pay for it is, the government believes, one of the keys to getting the economy going. So ministers want to hear from parents and childcare providers on whether to reduce the academic qualifications for people wanting to work in nurseries like GCSE Maths to create a bigger pool to hire from.
OK, right preschool, are we all ready to have story time with Lucy?
Nurseries are getting nervous about plans to change staffing to deliver the government's plan to expand free childcare.
A tiger?
It wants to relax the rules on early years staffing to help deal with the increased demand, so childcare workers won't have to have a GCSE in maths to work in a nursery.
Mathematics in early years, especially for like younger children, it's all about like your shape sorters, your jigsaws. So do you need a maths GCSE in order to be able to support a toddler or a baby in that skill? No, I don't think you do.
But there are safety concerns about plans to change the child-to-carer ratios. Already the government's gone ahead with plans to increase the number of 2-year-olds one person can look after. But this nursery say they won't put that extra pressure on staff.
So if you had 10 2-year-olds, that's 2 members of staff. But as I think anybody knows, not just the early years workforce, that 2 to 3-year-olds are a really challenging age.
So you're just not going to do it?
No.
But educating young minds doesn't come cheap. From September 2025, working parents of children under the age of 5 will be entitled to 30 hours free childcare per week. And there are concerns that to deliver that may mean a drop in standards.
We are early years educators, we're not just babysitters, it's not even childcare, it is early education, and we know from 0 to 5 is the most crucial time for a child. So we should be seen as more professional in our industry, and I think that would attract more people. I think keeping the qualifications, upping the standard of early years education would actually attract more people into the profession.
The government says this is not about watering down the profession, and it will listen to providers during the consultation. But the Early Years Alliance, which represents the industry, is concerned that the government's promise of free childcare will be at the cost of quality. Stacey Foster, News at 10.
There was an emergency on Bournemouth Beach this afternoon when at least 2 people had to be pulled to safety from the sea. A huge rescue operation swung into action. 3 helicopters, 6 ambulances, 1 lifeboat, 2 Coast Guard teams, 1 critical care car and a hazard response vehicle went to the scene. 2 people were taken to hospital. The Coast Guard said it had checked to make sure no one else was in the water. The beach had been packed with people enjoying the sun during the half-term break. A wildfire that has been burning near Loch Ness is so big that the smoke it has been creating can be seen from space. The smoke plume in the centre of this picture from NASA shows it drifting 12 miles towards the loch. The fire covers an area roughly 5 miles by 5 miles. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service is investigating what caused it. There are suggestions wild campers may have been to blame. The Scottish Government says it will try to raise awareness of the risk from such fires after a spell of warm, dry weather. Now, it was always tough picking a World Cup squad. For the manager of the England women's team, Sarina Wiegman, it has been made more difficult with so many injuries to her Euros winning side. But star defender Lucy Bronze is fit. Millie Bright almost is, and she will be captain, although Sarina Wiegman hadn't actually told her. The Spurs striker, Bethany England, is in the squad. So a mixture of experience and what for the Lionesses will be raw talent. As for TV coverage of the competition to be held in Australia and New Zealand, no deal has yet been confirmed, but Miss Wiegman said she wasn't worried about that.
To look for defenders, midfielders and strikers and goalkeepers. Don't forget the goalkeepers.
Sarina Wiegman admitted to her young audience today that she's agonised these past weeks about who will be wearing a Lionesses shirt at this summer's World Cup. Fate has conspired against her, and mainly through serious injury, England's boss has lost the spine of her Euros winning team.
You're talking a little bit in transition now, so with some changes in the team, but I still think we're really good and we have very talented players. And we're just going to make sure that we're going to be at our best, and then we see how far we get.
From the side that started the Euros final last year, there are some key players missing. Ellen White has retired. Captain Leah Williamson is sidelined after an ACL injury. Likewise, the Lionesses' top scorer in the tournament, Beth Mead. The influential Fran Kirby also has a knee injury and is unavailable. Millie Bright has been named as captain but hasn't played since March. Lucy Bronze is included too but has been out for a month after knee surgery.
Sarina Wiegman's aware we're going into the tournament with not the best team, best squad, but what they need to have is togetherness, and we still have the quality to go to Australia and New Zealand to do something really big, as the Lionesses did in England last summer.
Sprinkled with new faces.
Behave like normal, do your best, get connected with fans and perform at your highest level, and hopefully that will bring us very far in the tournament, because as you know we all have a dream too, going to the World Cup. This is the very last question. The very last.
Led by Wiegman, the Lionesses have already catapulted the women's game to a new level. The impact of a World Cup win later this summer would match that and some. Steve Scott, News at 10.
Wouldn't that put a smile on all our faces? Now, still on sport, Cameron Norrie will keep the British flag flying into the third round of the French Open. The beautiful River Wye that flows through Wales and along the border with England has been the subject of many a masterpiece over the centuries. But the latest up-to-date assessment of the quality of the water in it paints a very depressing picture. Its cleanliness rating has been downgraded still further. Yes, some of it is sewage pollution, but most is from farming. Big sheds of intensively reared hens and livestock farms straddle the border, pouring all sorts into the river. Manure, in other words.
The water might look appealing, but this iconic river, which meanders through the beautiful Wye Valley, is in serious danger. Rob Goldsworth has fished on the Wye in his hometown of Hay since he was a boy. He's seen many changes to the river in his time, but his primary concern is human sewage being dumped into the water.
It generally happens at times of higher water flows. It effectively overcharges the sewage works and it has to spill out into the river. Is that acceptable? Not really, is it?
The primary reason for the river's downgrade by Natural England is because of falling populations of Atlantic salmon and white-clawed crayfish. The cause of this crisis, it is claimed, is primarily a large increase of intensive chicken farms in the Wye Valley. The area's wildlife trusts say that the river has been turned into a pea soup of farm pollution, causing algae to bloom and starving the river's fish and plants of oxygen.
The announcement that we've heard is not new news. People are concerned about the river, seeing it decline, and the facts speak for themselves. The river is in real crisis. We need rapid action fast.
Last year, the Welsh Environment Agency Natural Resources Wales accepted publicly that poultry manure is harming rivers in the Wye area. But there's a lack of hard evidence, something a local water testing project in conjunction with Cardiff University is hoping to change.
We can't say it's this, we can't say it's that right now. And this is exactly why we've set up this project, to try to determine with hard evidence, collecting data over the course of 2 years, sampling exactly what's causing the algal bloom.
The Wye Valley's lush green hills attract millions every year, but all too often the quality of its famous river is extremely poor. The UK and Welsh governments say they're committed to saving this great British waterway, but even with radical action, it could take at least a decade to turn this ugly duckling of a river back into a swan. Rhys Williams, News at 10, the Wye Valley.
Finally, proof that you are never too old to try something new, even if that occasionally means winging it. When 80-year-old Nancy Spencer decided she wanted to raise money for the hospice that cared for her husband in his dying days, she thought she'd have a go at, wait for it, wing walking. She took to the skies on a biplane flying at 135 miles an hour. She'd already tried abseiling. Mrs. Spencer says she feels less fear as she gets older. You don't say. Oh, and she's just had a pacemaker fitted.
They say age is just a number. But what about these numbers? 700 feet in the air here is Nancy Spencer. She is strapped to the wing of a Boeing Stearman biplane flying at a top speed of 135 miles per hour. And she is 80, yes 80, years old. Now safely back on terra firma and watching her accomplishment, the octogenarian tells us she did have some pre-flight nerves.
That was when I started to feel nervous, when he started taxiing towards and I thought, what am I doing here? The hardest part was getting up on the plane because I'm only small. But once I was up there and I was all strapped in, I was fine. And it was only when he started taxiing down the runway I thought, oh my goodness, what am I doing? But then once we went up, amazing. Absolutely amazing. And the scenery over the Yorkshire Moor as well was just out of this world.
Nancy had never done a wing walk or anything like this before, but better late than never, and she did it now to raise money for St Teresa's Hospice in Darlington, where she volunteers and where her own husband spent the final days of his life.
My husband was diagnosed with cancer in 2012 on Christmas Eve morning, and that just brought a lot more meaningful to the hospice because no one ever knows, and no one ever knows when they're going to need these places.
Daredevil Nancy originally wanted to do a skydive, but she had to be talked down from that by doctors on account of having a pacemaker. Now she has the adrenaline bug though, so what next?
I think I better keep quiet for the moment because the family have told me to just calm down for a while, my daughter and granddaughter. I think it's mind over matter with everything. And if you push yourself, it's surprising what you can do.
Age is meant to mellow a person, and Nancy says there was peace to be found up there in the sky. She says she took a moment to speak to her late husband, telling him she misses him and she'll see him again. But not too soon, because she's already plotting the next challenge for her 90th birthday. Peter Smith, News at 10.
That is, without question, the best and most brilliant story of the year so far. Good moment to end. Good night. Thanks for watching.